future is unwritten, so what comes next is ours to write. We are the game changers, hands-on with real-world impact. We redesign the room and reimagine the concept, together, limited by nothing. Because when you write the future, there's always another page. So, what's next? Find out at RMIT.
It's that thrill of a new opportunity, of shared connection, of wrapping your head around how it all works. It's closing the pitch on a game-changing idea, the late nights spent with your teammates, and how industry shapes the world with each disruption, innovation, twist and turn. When we talk about business, it's more than just outdated corporate notions. It goes beyond water cooler conversations, 9 to 5s or profit and loss. It's fighting for the social and environmental impact of commercial decisions. It's learning the right questions to ask. It's finding the glass ceiling and breaking through. When we say business, we mean new models of enriched economies at local and global scale. We mean what's next for future skills, technology and beyond. When we say business, we mean it.
The future is unwritten, so what comes next is ours to write. We are the game changers, hands-on with real-world impact. We redesign the room and reimagine the concept, together, limited by nothing. Because when you write the future, there's always another page. So, what's next? Find out at RMIT.
It's that thrill of a new opportunity, of shared connection, of wrapping your head around how it all works. It's closing the pitch on a game-changing idea, the late nights spent with your teammates, and how industry shapes the world with each disruption, innovation, twist and turn. When we talk about business, it's more than just outdated corporate notions. It goes beyond water cooler conversations, 9 to 5s or profit and loss. It's fighting for the social and environmental impact of commercial decisions. It's learning the right questions to ask. It's finding the glass ceiling and breaking through. When we say business, we mean new models of enriched economies at local and global scale. We mean what's next for future skills, technology and beyond. When we say business, we mean it.
The future is unwritten, so what comes next is ours to write. We are the game changers, hands-on with real-world impact. We redesign the room and reimagine the concept, together, limited by nothing. Because when you write the future, there's always another page. So, what's next? Find out at RMIT.
It's that thrill of a new opportunity, of shared connection, of wrapping your head around how it all works. It's closing the pitch on a game-changing idea, the late nights spent with your teammates, and how industry shapes the world with each disruption, innovation, twist and turn. When we talk about business, it's more than just outdated corporate notions. It goes beyond water cooler conversations, 9 to 5s or profit and loss. It's fighting for the social and environmental impact of commercial decisions. It's learning the right questions to ask. It's finding the glass ceiling and breaking through. When we say business, we mean new models of enriched economies at local and global scale. We mean what's next for future skills, technology and beyond. When we say business, we mean it.
Woman Jika, everyone. My name is Frank Kennedy, Associate DVC Strategy and Innovation for the College of Business and Law. I feel privileged to welcome you all to our final webinar of the Thought Leadership Series, Keeping Australia Cyber Secure in 2021. Before we begin, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. This week is NAIDOC Week, and NAIDOC Week celebrates the rich history, diverse cultures, and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the oldest continuing cultures on the planet. This year's theme, Heal Country, Heal Our Nation, calls for us all to continue to seek greater protection for our lands, our waters, our sacred sites, and our culture heritage from exploitation, desecration, and destruction. Healing country means finally resolving many of the outstanding injustices which impact on the lives of our people. It is about hearing and actioning the aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which are the culmination of generations of consultation and discussion amongst our nations on a range of issues and grievances. RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders, past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. The College of Business and Law is holding different thought leadership events throughout the year, each on contemporary and compelling topics. Our aim is to showcase cutting-edge research combined with the insights and lived experiences of highly impactful industry experts. We seek to share this collective knowledge with our partners and broader community to begin or progress new conversations and actions. In this particular series, Keeping Australia Cyber Secure in 2021, we have partnered with the RMIT Centre for Cybersecurity and Research Innovation, which is led by my colleague, Professor Matthew Warren. For those of you who attended the first two webinars, I'm sure you would agree that the series has been a great success so far. Close to 400 people have joined through virtual technology to listen and engage with cybersecurity experts such as Tobias Faken, Australia's Cyber Affairs Ambassador, Jennifer Stockwell, who is Telstra's National Security Principal, and RMIT Associate Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, Professor Sudiwa Setung. And that's just to name a few of our speakers so far. In our first webinar on critical infrastructure, we discussed the level of responsibility the owners and regulators of critical infrastructure have in keeping Australia cyber secure. During last week's webinar, we presented an international perspective on cyber and critical technology, stressing the need for international collaboration between Australia and the Indo-Pacific. On that note, I would like to congratulate the Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation, as they will soon be launching a cybersecurity hub on our RMIT campus in Vietnam. Now, I'm sure Matt will share more details on this with you later today. Now I'm delighted to see more than 100 attendees online today which is a telling indicator of the importance of today's topic, ransomware. Professor Matt Warren will be hosting the panel discussion, where we will discuss ransomware attacks and what you can do to protect yourself and your business. I am therefore delighted to introduce Professor Matt Warren, who is the Director of the Cybersecurity and Research and Innovation Centre at the College of Business and Law. Matt is a researcher in cybersecurity and computer ethics and a Professor of Cybersecurity here at RMIT University. He has taught within Australia, Finland, Hong Kong, Lithuania and the UK, and has co-authored over 300 publications. Matt is a Fellow of the Australian Computer Society and gained his PhD in Information Security Risk Analysis from the University of Plymouth, UK. I'm now very excited to welcome Professor Matt Warren, and Matt, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Frank, and thank you for welcoming the webinar today. I'm happy that to be here today, and really ransomware, is such a topical area and something we're going to be sort of talking about it in great detail in a moment. So as Frank says, yes, we are launching a hub of our research centre in RMIT Vietnam. There'll be more information about the launch events in August, but really what it does is sort of highlight, the global applied research that we're undertaking in cybersecurity. So in terms of today, what we've seen, is an escalation in ransomware. You just have to turn on the news, to find out about the latest global ransomware attack that's impacting different parts of the world, including Australia. Our geography doesn't make us immune to these ransomware attacks. So that's precisely why we're talking about this topic today, is to talk about, the significant sort of disruption that ransomware can cause, and how, businesses and society can, protect against it. So what we're seeing is that cyber criminals are now using, new techniques, to undertake these attacks. They're now using cryptocurrency as the currency for cyber criminals. And one of our panelists, Tim Watts, refers to cyber criminals as modern day pirates, which really does, describe the situation. Pirates who, attack systems around the world without any thought of what they're doing. So as Frank sort of mentioned today, we're going to sort of talk in much more detail about ransomware, and talk about it from a sort of a national and international perspective. So before we get started, I just give you a quick overview of today's agenda. So we're going to have a brief introduction of our panel members, Professor Asha Bao, Tim Watts and Michael Stringer. And then we'll go straight into the panel discussion with a number of questions. And I know that a number of you, will have questions that you want to ask our panelists. And there's the option to do that in the Q&A session at the end of the event. So I encourage you all to submit your questions via the Q&A chat function, which is on the right hand side of your screen, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. So I'm very excited to welcome Professor Asha Bao. Asha is a professor and Associate Dean of Mathematical Science at the STEM College here at RMIT University. Asha has been involved with cybersecurity education at RMIT since 2001, and as the Programming Director for the Master of Cybersecurity, she's brought management and business into a mainly technical degree making many sort of links with cybersecurity industry. And I should also note that master's course is the longest running course in Australia. So that's again highlights how RMIT is being fussed in this field. Asha is a transdiscipline researcher in the fields of cyber mathematics. She's also a member of the RMIT Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation. Her research is focused on fraud and money laundering, and she's been involved in a number of open meetings and discussions around cybersecurity, including the United Nations and intergovernmental meetings on cybercrime. We're so delighted to have you on board, Asha.
Hello, Matt. Lovely to be here. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Tim Watts. Tim is the Shadow Assistant Minister for Cybersecurity and Communication at the Australian Parliament and is the federal member for Gillibrand here in Melbourne. Prior to entering politics, Tim was a senior manager at Telstra and previously served as a senior policy advisor to the former Communications Minister, Stephen Conway, and was a senior advisor to the Victorian Premier's office. Tim began his career as a solicitor, specialised in telecommunications law. A warm welcome to you, Tim.
It's great to be with you here, Matt, and I acknowledge that I'm joining you in this NAIDOC week from the lands of the people of the Bunurong, of the Kulin Nation, and I commit myself to the full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Thank you. And our final panelist today is Michael Stringer. Michael is a senior domain solutions architect for security in the AWS ANZ public sector team. Security is the highest priority at AWS, Amazon Web Services, and Michael works closely with the public sector organisations in government, health and education to enhance their security posture in relation to the AWS cloud. Wonderful to have you here with us today, Michael.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for having me along today, and thank you for everyone who's joined.
Thank you. So in terms of today, what we're going to do is really sort of explore, a number of different questions around ransomware, really to explore what it is, the impact of it. And then, as I said at the end, there's the option for the Q&A session where you can pose your own questions about this matter. And if time permitting, we'll sort of answer as many questions as we can. I'd like to ask the first question, and I'd like to ask it to you, Tim. So, Tim, as a parliamentarian, you really are the voice of ransomware here in Australia, highlighting the issues, that we face here in Australia, the steps that Australia needs to take to protect society and also government. But from your perspective, why do you think we're seeing an increase in ransomware attacks against businesses and organisations in Australia and also globally?
Thanks, Matt. Well, I suppose the perspective that I bring to this is this perspective of someone engaged in the industry, but not from a technical background. And given that, the way I look at this issue is like, well, why are ransomware attacks increasing in 2021 and through 2020? It's because the returns from mounting these attacks exceed the costs, put really simply. We have seen over time these groups mounting these attacks increase not only in sophistication, but in the resources available to them to mount these attacks. And, why wouldn't they? This is a crime of impunity at the moment. Very few of these attacks are ever, prosecuted through the legal system. Very few of them attract any kind of response from, offensive cyber type operations. So there are very limited costs in mounting these attacks, and there are very significant returns. I mean, when you look at the companies that analyze blockchain for the processing of these payments through crypto exchanges, you know, we see in 2020 like hundreds of millions of dollars worth of payments being made. You know, somewhere in the order of 30% of companies that have experienced these attacks make payments. And in recent times, we've seen the quantum of these payments increasing significantly. I mean, there was an insurer in the US last month that paid a $40 million payment. JBS last month, an $11 million payment. Colonial Pipeline, $5 million. Thankfully, some of those were intercepted by law enforcement agencies. But put shortly, until the costs of mounting these attacks, exceed the returns, we're going to see these attacks continue.
Thank you, Tim. And, and thank you for sort of bringing in some of those sort of global examples as well, which really, I suppose, sort of highlights, the global nature as well as Australian sort of nature of this. Asha, with your experience, looking at cyber crime, but what's your views on why we're seeing this sort of increase in Australia and globally with ransomware?
Okay, research is showing that with COVID and everybody moving online, there's just been an increase in all sorts of criminal activities online. They have basically moved. So the research we did with small and medium enterprises showed that they are now more susceptible. And the whole way this thing works is that if they want to generate money to be able to then finance their other activities. So that is basically, and with the increase in phishing, it's only natural that ransomware becomes another, increases in frequency.
Thank you, Asha. And Michael, in terms of yourself, sort of, with AWS and having a sort of a global as well as national infrastructure, from your industry perspective, why do you see that we do have an increase, in ransomware attacks occurring?
Well, to echo some of the points that Tim and Asha have made, first of all, it's lucrative. It's demonstrably earning money for these ransomware syndicates. There's been successful attacks, very high profile attacks. They're making a lot of money from it. And that leads on to the second point, where using digital currencies such as Bitcoin is making it very hard to trace the transactions involved, so the gangs can effectively get away with the attacks that they're carrying out. More generally, from an IT perspective, what we're seeing is that there are a lot of interconnected systems being joined up to the internet, and they're not being adequately patched, or security controls may be lax or not put in place correctly. And this is really an attack vector for a lot of these gangs. They're sharing these exploits with each other. They're building easy to use exploit kits that they can also share with other gangs. And some of the gangs are even doing attacks for hire, where people can actually rent them as a service and actually attack victims. So one of the other things we're seeing a lot is friendly geographies, if I can put it that way, who are harboring a lot of these attackers. And they kind of had a gentleman's agreement where, as long as they don't carry out attacks within the boundaries of the jurisdiction that they're in, and only limit their attacks to international targets, they basically turn a blind eye to the behaviour.
Thank you for that, and really thank you for everyone, because what you've done is sort of set the scene on why we are seeing this increase. An increase that's occurring globally. It's not just sort of impacting Australia. But coming back to an Australian context, because we have seen, some high profile examples, do you think that there's some particular sectors of the Australian economy that may be susceptible to ransomware attacks, or may be more attractive to those attackers? And I may just start with Tim, because I know this is something that you have commented on previously in Parliament and the media. Tim.
Sure, Matt. I mean, this is an extortion business, so the targets that are most vulnerable to these attacks are the targets that are most likely to pay. And the targets that are most likely to pay are organisations that just can't afford any kind of downtime in their business, or are susceptible to other forms of extortion, like information being leaked publicly. So we see from the examination of the IIC statistics that healthcare is a pretty regular target in this sector. I mean, obviously, the consequences of a healthcare IT system being down for any period of time are very significant, particularly in the middle of a public health crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, critical infrastructure providers. I mean, it wasn't a coincidence that the operators of the Colonial Pipeline paid so quickly when the consequences of downtime for a piece of infrastructure of that significance to the US economy was not available. Similarly, we see manufacturing companies that sort of operate on that real-time production schedules where the costs of downtime are very significant, also very likely to pay. But then as the business model of ransomware is iterated, and we've seen this double extortion model come on, and the threat of publicising information become a leverage point. Indeed, JBS said that was why they paid the ransom. They were able to get their systems back online pretty quickly, relatively speaking, but still paid to protect confidential client information. So in that context, we're seeing increasingly professional services firms be targeted because of the sensitivity of the information that they hold and their proclivity to pay. And you can see that in the quantum of the payment made by that insurance company in the US recently because of the sensitivity of the information that would have been disclosed had they not paid.
Thank you, Tim. And I may just go to Asha, because I know, Asha, you were talking about the research that you've been doing in the COVID situation around SMEs. In terms of that research, did you find that small businesses could be potentially, victims of ransomware?
Absolutely. It basically showed us that, what happened. One of the things that happened with COVID is that a lot of small businesses which were doing, business with the walk past trade and things like that, all of that went. They had to go online. They didn't have enough time. So, it's like they are small targets, but there are multitudes of them. The small business sector employs very large percentage, I think over 50% of people. So which means that sector as a whole is very susceptible and is a rich target for picking, unfortunately. So, yes.
Thank you. And Michael, with your experience of, with AWS, with that sort of, with the cloud really being the sort of a global infrastructure, how are you finding, different sectors of the economy in Australia or around the world, being susceptible to these type of ransomware attacks?
Yeah, it's pretty much echoes what the Australian Cybersecurity Centre said in their last ransomware report for 2020. I work in the public sector team, and this is a particular concern to me. So we're seeing health customers, particularly at the moment with COVID-19. It's very high profile to attack emergency services and health providers and pharmaceutical companies. Also education facilities, particularly because there's a lot of remote learning going on at the moment. And so there's a lot of opportunities to get remotely into networks. Government agencies, of course, federal, state agencies, particularly here in Australia. And then we're seeing transport. So there's been a number of high profile transport and logistics companies attacked over the last couple of years. And then it's retail. So, and as Tim was saying earlier, it's really about who will pay up and what the appetite is for reputational damage to the organisations and what their willingness to pay.
Thank you. And we've spoken really about these groups, and Michael mentioned about this concept of friendly geography. Do we actually know who's behind these attacks? And Tim, I know this is something that you spend a lot of time looking at. From your perspective, who do you think are behind these ransomware attacks?
Well, Matt, one thing to say about this is the more things change, the more they stay the same. As Michael was saying earlier, a large number of these threat actors are based in, it's called colloquially Eastern Europe. In fact, when you look at the job ads put on these dark web forums through these ransomware affiliate groups, they'll very frequently specify, you can work with us, but so long as you don't target CIS, targets, so Commonwealth of Independent States, kind of countries in the Russian orbit. With that said, there has been a lot of change in this space about who these threat actors are. We've got a pretty good idea of who they are, but they sort of have this habit of sort of phoenixing and coming back slightly differently. We've seen their business models iterating a lot. So, for the last 12 months, we've seen that ransomware as a service model where you have different groups specializing and coming in and providing different parts of the ransomware task. You'll have initial access brokers, you'll have people that specialize in providing the encryption to lock up the systems. You have other groups that specialize in the shakedown, even to the extent of providing sort of call center services targeting board members and executives. But I think a really interesting thing we've seen this month is a further iteration of that model. I think some people are seeing the writing on the wall that this decentralized affiliate model has a few points of intervention that law enforcement and signals agencies can target, on the forums, the payment distribution, the identity of individuals within those groups. And there's a group called Hades that's come out in the last month that seems to be bringing that all back internally, vertically integrating again, putting a greater focus on OPSEC within the organisation. And you can see they're kind of thinking ahead, iterating, preparing for the next world where law enforcement and signals intelligence is going to be striking back against these groups.
Thank you. And Michael, with your AWS sort of perspective in terms of a global company, you must, deal with a lot of the cyber threats globally. Where do you see the issues sort of arising from?
Yep, to echo what Tim said, mostly Eastern Europe. So former Soviet states. There's several well-organised Russian-speaking gangs operating in this space. A good example is REvil, who are a Russian-speaking syndicate. They carried out the Kaseya attack that just occurred over the last weekend, a supply chain attack, which has given them access to hundreds of customers downstream through the remote access software. And there's other groups as well, CLOP, who are also a Russian-speaking group, and a few others. And it's interesting, some of them have a kind of moral code of ethics. There's one group that specifically says they won't target health and education. But then conversely, one of the other groups we've been tracking specifically says they will attack pharmaceutical and health companies who they believe are profiting from COVID.
So it's an interesting mix, and it's interesting, Michael, that you bring in that ethical code of conduct to it as well. So it's and Asha, from what you've been looking at in terms of small businesses and groups behind them, what's your view regarding where these groups are from?
As Michael and Tim are saying, it is highly likely that they are from Eastern Europe, and I know that's the tracking that's happening. So it's almost like I was just listening to both of them and thinking now that they are restructuring and they are is there honor among thieves, and yes. So whether often what I also see is if they're trying to get into the larger companies, then the smaller companies which are doing business via these larger companies are then going to be susceptible. Because it's the weakest link in that chain. So they're trying to get to that weakest link in the chain. So it may not be that the small businesses are actually the target. They could be the conduit to the larger businesses.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask, so we've been talking a lot about, the ransomware attacks on organizations. And I wonder what steps an organization can take to protect themselves? And I'll start with Asha from an SME perspective, then Michael from a global, and then Tim from a, I suppose, a society perspective. So Asha.
Yes, so the way I look at it is, with all the years of teaching and managing the cybersecurity degree, is we need to get hardening. And hardening is by having layers and layers of security. You can't be certain. So you have to do everything from making sure you're patching, that you're updating your software, whether it is antivirus, malware, firewall, whatever. All of that is being done. But also, do you have a disaster recovery plan? Do you have a business continuity plan? Those two are very important. And one of the best ways to counter ransomware in particular is to make sure that you have backups. That the backups are not, that the backups are not compromised. And often what happens is if a company doesn't have a disaster recovery plan or a business continuity plan, then they don't even know if their backups are working. There are so many instances that you don't know. So that is where you start all the little things. But from a cybersecurity perspective for small business, it is hard. Many of them have not been online, and then they had to move very, very quickly online. So how do we help them?
Thank you. And Michael, from a corporate perspective, how do you see corporations dealing with this issue of ransomware?
There's a really number of different strategies that people should make sure they're following, and probably the most important one is patching your systems and making sure you're applying security patches when they become available. We see a lot of instances where people have just not patched, and then an exploit gets into their systems through lack of patching. The second is making sure they're controlling access to the environment. So putting in things like second factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, make sure that people aren't guessing or cracking passwords and getting into their systems. Education is a big one with our customers, and we do it ourselves as a corporate, and we encourage our customers to do it as well. Educating all employees to watch out for things like phishing attacks by email, we're clicking on bad URLs and downloading malware, making sure that everyone is aware that these attack vectors exist and what to do. And and as Asha was saying, backups are so important. Making sure that you have verified working backups, daily backups of your environment. And I would highly recommend that you're making backup copies to an offsite location, so that you make sure that if they're in case of a compromise of your local network or your local systems, that you still have a copy of that data available elsewhere.
Thank you. And Tim, from your perspective, from a whole of nation perspective, what should governments be doing, to help protect countries against ransomware attacks?
Yeah, well, so obviously this conversation starts with an uplift of the cyber resilience of individual organisations, hardening up their IT systems. But there are some, and that would deal with the bulk of attacks that we've seen so far. There are some reasons for concern about the future prospects of that strategy, a sort of a organisation-based strategy. This Casado attack kind of attacks one of the vectors that we use for patching. Those automated downloads, the transmission of those updates, which makes it really difficult for an individual organisation to defend an attack through that particular vector. Similarly, with the scale of the resource being acquired by these firms, by these ransomware threat groups, we're going to get to a world where they have the resources to acquire ODA themselves and to launch attacks. Now, we haven't seen that so far, and this Casado attack is not ODA strictly speaking. But that's a world we're going to get to if the current trajectory continues. So, what I've been arguing for some time now is that, look, we need to think beyond an individual organisational approach to resolving this issue. We need government to be having a coordinated strategy across all the levers available to it to try to increase the costs imposed on these threat groups of mounting ransomware attacks and to reduce their returns. So we think there's lots that government can be doing across policy, across regulation, law enforcement, diplomacy, offensive cyber, none of which are silver bullets, none of which are going to make this problem go away, but all of which taken collectively together over time, we think might be able to move the needle and reduce the volume of these attacks. A lot of this is pretty boring stuff from a technical perspective. I mean, I think back to the way that we shut down all of the big spam crews, previous generations, shutting down credit card providers servicing these groups until there was sort of only one provider left servicing them. That made it a lot more difficult for these groups to operate, and it did reduce the scale of the problem. I think there are very significant prospects for increased application of anti-money laundering regulations against particularly the crypto exchanges where cryptocurrency is transferred into fiat currency. We've seen just the threat of this kind of regulation recently really change the way that some of these exchanges operate. I mean, Binance played a big part in a takedown operation against the money launderers for the CLOP ransomware group in Ukraine recently. Binance is a group that an exchange that people have said has sort of had some pretty high risk customers, and even the threat of regulatory intervention there has really increased the cooperation provided there. So again, not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve the problem, but taken collective, we think it can have an impact.
Thank you. Now, one of the areas that's been linked to the growth of ransomware is the fact that there's now cyber insurance, and insurance can be used to pay ransoms potentially. So the question is, do you feel that cyber insurance has actually created an escalation in ransomware because it's created a market that companies can use to pay these ransoms? I may start with Tim, then Michael, then Asha. So Tim, from your perspective, what's your view regarding cyber insurance?
Look, it's certainly a part of, I think, both the problem and the solution here. So we know from interviews with members of these ransomware groups that they look for organisations with insurance, and they'll go through organisations' IT systems to try and find the insurance policies to see how much they're covered for, and then pitch their ransom demands at that. We've even seen what looks like an example of a ransomware crew owning up an insurance company, working their way through the cyber insurance book, and then targeting those organisations for the very fact that they had cyber insurance. So it's clearly a bit of a honeypot for threat actors. That being said, I think insurers can be a big part of the solution to this problem as well. Like insurers can put that cost pressure into organisations to drive better cyber maturity. The kind of the checklists of controls that are required before people have access to cyber insurance markets. Changing behaviour for clients is a big part of the problem here, a big part of the solution to this problem, I think, particularly when at the moment ransoms are set at a rate beneath the cost of the outages. If you can change that equation, you can affect the ROI as well.
Thank you, Tim. Michael, from your corporate sort of perspective, you must deal with a lot of organizations that have, different levels of cyber insurance. What's your perspective about the role of cyber insurance?
I think it's a double-edged sword. There's obviously a need for firms and companies and organizations to have that support when it's made available financially. Otherwise, they could risk a company-ending event where they just can't afford to pay the ransom, and that's the end of the business or the organisation. On the other hand, the ACSE recommend that people do not pay ransoms. I personally believe that should be the case as well, where possible. You may even be opening yourself to criminal actions as well by paying the ransom. And it's, yes, I can see why people do it, but I think it's also normalizing the behavior. It's making it a standard business risk where there's just an acceptable way to deal with it by having insurance, and I don't think that's really addressing the root cause of the issue.
Thank you. And Asha, with your research into SMEs in the COVID period, what's your views around the impact of cyber insurance?
So one of the things we found is, for example, if you go back to 2017 and the NotPetya attack on Mondelez, Zurich Insurance refused to pay. So that was a big, and it's still in the courts. So the question is basically, when you look at malware, one person can create it and other people can use it. So you can't find the exact perpetrator. And that is one of the problems with insurance. So you could buy insurance and that insurance may not cover you. And I wonder in many ways, should we look at ransomware as a terrorist attack? So if you look at it, and that is what Zurich Insurance used to refuse the NotPetya claim of Mondelez. It said it's a terrorist attack. So I'm wondering how soon will the insurance companies claim that ransomware is a terrorist attack? And we all know that the line that is held is that you don't pay ransom to terrorists. So that looks like very much where it will go.
Excellent. No, that's an interesting point, Asha. But what I'm going to do now is go over to the Q&A questions that the panelists have asked. So thank you for the wonderful questions. I think what you've done is really set the context of what ransomware is, the difficulties organizations face. But we have many interested members of the audience who have posted our questions. So the first question I'll ask is, do you think during the COVID period that people, working remotely has reduced organizational controls from attacks, and how can businesses respond to cyber attacks when staff are sort of working from home and the security controls are difficult to maintain? So I'll start with Asha, then pass it to Michael and Tim.
Yes, so that is exactly what we found, is that with COVID-19 and people working from home, that corporate umbrella of security was no longer available, which meant each and every single one of us needs to be more security aware. So, and I know that corporations are doing things like doing cybersecurity, phishing simulations, trying to train their staff on phishing simulations, and to the extent that often staff then refuse to click on any link at all. So where is the balance and how do we address it is a very, very interesting and important question.
Excellent, thank you. And Michael, from your sort of corporate perspective?
Yeah, it's I agree with what Asha has said as well. So it's made it more difficult, particularly for small enterprises as well, where they may not have many people in IT already, or there may be IT is a part-time job in the organisation. It makes it harder to control the remote environments. People are working with laptops, and they may be working with mobile devices such as tablets and telephones as well. And it can be hard to fully control and put security and monitoring in place. Larger enterprises, I think in a way it's a lot easier for them. They have the budget and they have the people to put in place for monitoring, but especially for SMEs, I think it can be really difficult. And coming back to what Asha said and what I said earlier about education, training staff in particular is of primary importance, particularly in remote situations. They may be getting text messages, SMSs, they may be getting emails, and they may be getting phone calls as well. So this happens quite a lot where people are trying to get them to share information and also click on links and that kind of thing. And so really educating their staff is key.
Thank you. And Tim, your view around, the impact of COVID on ransomware and other types of cyber incidences?
Oh, look, I'd endorse everything that Michael and Asha has said. The only thing I'd add is, we're at a kind of an interesting point in the industry at the moment, because it's been sort of 12 to 18 months of just constant incidents. I'm hearing a lot of fatigue from incident responders and from people in the industry trying to deal with this deluge of attacks, and that kind of just human fatigue and resources being stretched in the cause of defence, that's going to have consequences too. I'm certain.
It's a good point, and often that sort of human aspects of cyber in terms of the defenders is often overlooked. We have another question. Should the disclosure of ransomware attacks on public companies and organizations be mandatory? And I'll start with Tim, then Michael, then Asha.
So I suppose there are a few things just to note about that, starting with, like, it may well be mandatory depending on the circumstances at the moment. I mean, there may be continuous disclosure obligations if the size of the attack is significant enough. And there are some industry-specific obligations. You know, if this critical infrastructure bill that the government is introducing passes, there will be some notification requirements attached to that for critical infrastructure providers. But overall, there's not a direct obligation. Sorry, we also have the mandatory data breach notification regime, but that won't capture all these incidents. So we think there's a bit of an information vacuum here, and that's why in the latest sitting of Parliament, I introduced a private members bill to set up a mandatory notification scheme for companies that choose to make that payment. As I tend to agree with Michael that, you know, we should never make these payments. But I also understand that some companies can sometimes feel coerced and feel forced to make those payments. Now, if that's the case, we want government to be involved in that. That's a decision that doesn't just affect the organisation, it's a decision that affects the whole ecosystem. So we want to capture information about those payments that are being made, you know, any IOCs, any actionable threat intel that we can share throughout the community. And, you know, things like Bitcoin wallets, addresses, things like that, so that we can try and interdict any payments.
Wonderful, thank you. And Michael, from your sort of experience, you know, with a large global organization, do you see sort of mandatory notification, you know, the way to go?
I do, and I'm really glad to see that Tim had introduced that private members bill into local parliament. We're seeing mandatory reporting become the norm in a lot of countries. And for the EU, the GDPR has mandatory reporting guidelines. President Biden in the US signed an executive order a few weeks ago about cybersecurity and also having reporting put in place. There are some reporting mechanisms available in Australia today. So for financial services, under the APRA CPS 234 guidelines, they do have to report data breaches. We have the Privacy Act, and also for anybody who's a listed company, the ASX will want to know about market sensitive information. But this is all a bit piecemeal, and it doesn't cover every organisation, and particularly you know, there's public sector, there's small, medium enterprises, there's listed and unlisted companies and so on, private or public. And we really need something that's in place, that's enforceable. And like Tim said, as well as having the mandatory reporting guidelines in place, there also needs to be that helping hand to help step in and advise and provide guidance.
Thank you. And Asha, with your, I was wondering your view, but also because you've been, you know, looking at SMEs in this COVID period, whether you had a view from an SME perspective.
Not only just I would prefer to talk about this from a risk management perspective. And I think if you make you know, the reporting mandatory, then it would improve the risk management practices of these companies. So one of the things is when you're looking at patching or backing up and things like that, or having those, if there is mandatory reporting, then it's more likely that that will come into the risk management practices as a whole of the company, and not be put aside as an IT problem, though I'm not saying that it is. I'm just saying that it will increase compliance if it becomes a law. Like, for example, with the Anti-Money Laundering and the Terrorism Financing Act, is paying ransomware to paying the people who are doing a ransomware attack against you. If that comes into the Anti-Money Laundering Counter-Terrorism Financing Act, what will be the consequences? And I know when I started doing research on SMEs back in 2008, 2009, the Anti-Money Laundering Counter-Terrorism Financing Act did not apply to small and medium enterprises. And so that was definitely changed in about 2011-12.
So, thank you. We have a question that's a slightly different one. It's about the role of government and really the role that government has to assist organisations or SMEs to deal with the situation. So the question asks about funding assistance, but is there other assistance that governments could provide for SMEs or larger organisations? I'll start with Tim first, then Asha from an SME perspective, and then Michael.
Yeah, I do think SMEs is a bit of a blind spot in cybersecurity policy in Australia at the moment. I say that because there are a number of programs designed to be targeted at SMEs to help them uplift their cyber resilience, but it's really sort of only preaching to the converted. There's a PDF on the ACSC's website, the cybersecurity essentials for small business. There are millions of small businesses in this country, but that PDF has been downloaded around less than 10,000 times. So it's kind of not reaching out into the community in the way that we need it to. I look around the world at other policy frameworks, other governments, and there's a lot more of an active approach there. The UK, through the NCSC, has a cyber essentials certification framework there that's kind of like a stripped back top 4 type certification, and they require that for anyone that's doing business with the UK government, and you can sort of see how that sort of starts to push maturity, resilience out through the SME ecosystem. So yeah, I think it's a really big part of the problem here, and we probably need to be looking at some new solutions to addressing it.
And Tim, I just have a follow-up there. When we talk about government, do you think state governments also have a role to play in this? Because we're now seeing state governments developing cybersecurity strategies. Do you see a role that state governments have in helping SMEs in their states to deal with these issues?
Look, I mean, the state government's interventions that I've seen have been focused either on sort of industry development, so building out cybersecurity companies within their jurisdictions, or on an uplift of resilience within state-owned entities or within state government departments. I haven't seen as much on the SME side. What I would say, though, is that I think a big part of the problem to solving this SME resilience maturity issue is disseminating information through trusted sources of information that SMEs already rely on. And in some instances that will be state government entities. There are small business sort of mentoring and outreach type entities within state governments that could be a really useful source of dispersing this information. More broadly, I'm thinking of bank managers, insurance brokers, local chambers of commerce, local government, small business entities. But yeah, so as a trusted intermediary, I think state governments could absolutely play a role.
Yes, excellent. Thank you. And Asha, based on your experience, but also the research that you've been looking at SMEs in this COVID period, do you think government assistance would help them?
Oh, absolutely. So recent research that has just appeared on the journal Computers and Security we did a review of small SMEs and their cybersecurity profiles, and we found that there is an urgent need for effective and suitable cybersecurity solutions. Most of the cybersecurity solutions that are there are targeted towards larger organizations, and the fact that larger organizations have been able to come together and form forums means that they are better protected, which makes SMEs more susceptible. And there are good points and bad points, but we feel that this couple of papers that we published earlier this year and late last year in the Digital Governance Journal is we are saying that what we need is something like, the software, like, for example, Mind Your Own Business, MYOB, which targets smaller businesses. We need something like that from a cybersecurity point of view, specifically for small and medium enterprises.
Thank you. And Michael, based on your experience from the corporate perspective, do you think government needs to assist SMEs?
I definitely do. It's a lot easier for large enterprises and large organisations, I think. They have the resources. There's a lot of prescriptive guidance already available, targeted toward them as well. And so they get a lot of the attention. But if the SMEs tend to get left behind, like as I said earlier, they don't have the staff. There may be people doing IT in those organisations part-time. Sometimes they're just, family companies, and they don't have any IT experience or expertise, and they're really relying on outside help. And I think those organisations in particular sorely need that assistance, whether it comes from state or federal government level. It's definitely something that they require. They need someone to help step in, show them best practices, and also make it as easy as possible, because if it's too hard, it's not going to get done because they have so many other priorities.
Excellent. And thank you on that sort of final answer. So I'm afraid we're coming to an end. All good things have to come to an end. So I'd like to thank the audience for publishing all those questions. Unfortunately, because of time constraints, we weren't able, to work through all of them. I'd really like to thank the panel today, Tim, Asha, and Michael, for having this really in-depth and engaged discussion around ransomware. I'd like to hand over to Frank Kennedy now.
Thank you, Matt. Another great facilitation of such an important webinar. It's been a pleasure watching and listening to the panel discussion. Many thanks and well done to everyone, particularly the amazing session and content that we've just had. It is great to see the number of questions that are being submitted, and it's always encouraging to see the level of engagement in our webinars. There were many important points made, and I would like to again thank our panel members, Asha, Tim, and Michael, for sharing their time and insights with us, and our production team, Leah and Rowan, for making the webinar possible. I look forward to when our paths will cross again and to future collaborations. If you are in the audience today and want to learn more about us and how you can get involved, please feel free to reach out. We are always interested in hearing from you, and we are keen to establish new engagement opportunities. Simply send an email to either Laki Kondilis, the Deputy Director of the Cybersecurity Centre, or Sarah Kincotta, Industry Relationship Manager at the College of Business and Law. With that said, we have arrived at the end of our webinar today, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We will be sending you a follow-up email later, including a recording of this session, together with a survey and some useful links that you might be interested in. Now, this is all from me. Take care and stay safe. Goodbye.